Hi, and welcome to another episode of Redefining Rural, sponsored by CSU Global. Today we have our regular hosts, Michelle Murphy and Danielle LaPlatte, with their guests here to talk about how schools are funded.
Thanks, Alex. We're really excited to be here today. We have two experts in what at least Danielle and I consider to be a phenomenally interesting topic, school finance, and more specifically, school finance formulas, their impact on rural schools around the state, comparisons to other states. And before we dig in, I just wanted to warn the listeners, it's incredibly complicated. So we're going to do our best to keep it at a level that we can all understand. So before we dig in, let's have our guests introduce themselves. First, Glenn, can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm Glenn McLean. I'm superintendent of the Platte Valley School District in Kersey, Colorado, which is just east of Greeley in Weld County. Our district is about 1,200 students, and we cover about 288 square miles on the eastern edge of Weld County. I've been with the district for 29 years now, the first 8 of which I was the business official, and that's how I got involved in school finance. I was working at that time with the Financial Policies and Procedures Committee with the Colorado Department of Education and involved with the 94 School Finance Act when it changed from the previous Finance Act. That was a little bit different structure. And then I became superintendent and have been continuing to be involved in school finance throughout my career. The Platte Valley School District, with our 1,200 kids, we have a very supportive community. We've been fortunate enough in the past 15 years to pass 3 mill levy overrides and 3 bond issues every 5 years, and we are now working on our 4th iteration of that in this current election season. Another thing that I'm involved with, there's a current effort on mill levy equalization, and I'm working with the Colorado School Finance Project on that.
Wow, he's about to take us down a whole nother road. Before you do that, and I think that might be an entirely different show, I think before we turn to Lisa, can you talk to us a little bit, because you've already alluded to it, how does our current school finance formula, which, as Glenn stated, was written in 1994, so we're still operating under a very old formula, talk a little bit about how that works, Glenn. Where does school districts' revenue come from?
So the Public School Finance Act of 94, it's what's called an equalization program, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But we start with determining total program, and total program is another way of just saying your total funding. And we start with counting students, and we call the October pupil count, which is just coming up next week for school districts all across the state. And there's lots of rules about that, but basically you count students and come up with what's called an FTE. So there's certain rules of why certain kids don't count for a full FTE, but you follow those rules and you come up with a number. And then you take that funded and then you multiply that times a per pupil funding. And we'll talk a little bit more of what that is, but you have a base funding, which is the base funding for everybody.
So all districts in the state get the same base funding, right?
They start with that base funding, and then they have factors that adjust that base funding. So there's a cost of living factor. So the cost of living, one of the classic examples of that, the cost of living for Boulder is different than the cost of living for Lyman or Burlington. The cost of living in Grand Junction is different than the cost of living in Lamar. And so there's a cost of living factor that's adjusted. There's a personnel cost factor, which is almost directly tied to that cost of living factor, but the personnel. And then there's a size factor, which is the big one. So we have school districts of very few kids in almost the single digits on a couple Eastern Plain districts, up to almost 100,000 when you get into Denver Public Schools and Jefferson Public Schools. And so that size factor dramatically, it's up to a factor of 2. So if that base funding and adjusts, and I think the average right now is in the high 7,000s. So there are districts that are very small that size factor takes it up to almost $16,000 per student. But like a very large district, that gets virtually no size factor, and so then they're much more around that average per student amount. So then you multiply those two, the per student times the base that has been adjusted by those factors, and you get what's called the total program. Then what happens is on a local level, and this is what we call the equalization part, local property taxes, so whatever the local mill levy is times the assessed value raises some local money. So we're just going to use some round numbers here. Let's just say it's $8,000 a student, and you have 10,000 students, so that's $80 million. Let's say the local property tax of that raises $60 million. And there's a smaller amount in there, which is specific ownership tax, which is a vehicle use tax. But the property tax and that other SOT, let's say it raises $60 million. Then the state funding comes in, and that's at $20 million. Now, if that local funding only raised $30 million of the $80 million, then the state part would be $50 million. That's how you get that equalization part. Then starting in 2009, after the Great Recession, the legislature determined that they couldn't afford the entire Finance Act, and so then there's a reduction. It was called the negative factor, and it's now called the budget stabilization factor. And right now that's between, it's around 8%. And so then everybody's overall funding is reduced by 8%. You had a question in there, Michelle?
Nope, I was going to stop you, and thank you for that, and turn it over to Lisa Weil from Great Education Colorado, one of my favorite people in the world, I would say, and a mentor. Go ahead and tell us about yourself, your organization, and then we'll dig into how well you think the formula is providing for our kids around the state.
Sure. Well, Lisa Weil with Great Education Colorado, a proud graduate of Greeley Public Schools. Glenn, a little bit to the west of you. Great Education Colorado is a statewide organization that has a vision of Colorado where every student, no matter where they live, no matter how they learn, no matter what the zip code, that every student graduates ready to lead their best life. And the way that we work toward that is that we build a grassroots network and coalitions that work for adequate, equitable, sustainable funding of our schools. We started in a living room of one of our founders, 16 years ago, as just some pre-K moms who recognized that our state wasn't funding our schools either adequately enough to really meet the needs of all kids, or equitably to make sure that every district had what they need and every student within those districts had what they need. And we realized that in Colorado, where actually our voters are the tax policy makers, that we needed to create an organization that would help inform and empower individuals and bring organizations together to raise this issue and say, this is how we're doing in Colorado. We know that public education is fundamentally important to the state, to the economy, and to individuals. I think everybody recognizes it, but somehow Colorado wasn't doing a good enough job at making sure that every student has, as I said, that vision, that what they need to graduate ready to really thrive. And so what Glenn has just been talking about is a school finance formula that needs to be updated because a lot has changed since 1994. But the part that he mentioned there as a result of the Great Recession is the budget stabilization factor.
We like to call it the BS factor.
I was looking to Michelle to see if it was okay to say that on a podcast.
I draw the line on what's okay or not. I love it.
So the BS factor that happened in 2009, the School Finance Act was functioning, and it was doing some, as Glenn talked about, those factors. We call them the fairness factors, the things that make sure that a rural district that has just no access to economies of scale gets increased funding to recognize what's necessary to give those rural students the opportunities they need. In 2009, that formula that was functioning and probably could have used some updating to make it really responsive to Colorado and our sort of our new demographics and realities, just lopped off 10%, then became 12%, at one point 16% of what was determined to be necessary. And even then, we had already decided that the school funding wasn't enough when we got together in that living room. Now, below that, it was cutting at one point as much as $1.1 billion out of our school funding formula. As of now, it's been $8 billion that's been cut out of our school funding formula.
That's 1.1 billion annually.
That was 1.1 billion.
Right?
And now, after years of recovery, Colorado having one of the hottest economies in the country, we have reduced that BS factor to $572 million a year. That comes to about $600-700 a kid. And so, as you think about your schools, multiply the number of kids in that school times that. And by the way, much more because of the way the school finance formula works. It cut more in rural schools than it did in schools that are closer to the base. So now what we're talking about is falling that far behind, just keeping up with inflation from a decade ago. That's why we have statistics like Colorado is $2,700 behind the national average. Think about that school you just calculated how much it would be. Multiply the number of kids times $2,700, and that's how much that student would be getting, or their school would be getting, if Colorado were getting a C. This is how we've come to have huge teacher shortage issues, especially in rural Colorado. And as a matter of fact, Colorado has the distinction of being the absolute last, the state with the biggest gap between what teachers make and what they could make in other professions for which they're qualified for. So we have literally the least competitive wages for our teachers in the nation, and so it's not a surprise that we're having a hard time finding teachers to come, to stay, and Glenn can speak, I'm sure, to that challenge in rural schools and some of the other consequences of just lopping off that kind of fundamental funding for every district.
So before we get into what Great Ed is doing to try and combat the problem, Glenn, can you talk a little bit about the realities in your district, and maybe talk too about how your district, because of the oil and gas revenues, is sort of situated differently than others with the state and local revenue?
Right. So in my example, I talked about you start with that local funding. Well, there's been we're in Weld County, which is one of the major concentrations of oil and gas activity in the state of Colorado, or really in the nation. And oil and gas is taxed, and it adds to our assessed value. And so our assessed value has grown dramatically over the years, to the point where when you take that per pupil amount times the number of pupils, we are raising all of that locally. It's 100% local funding. We're getting zero from the state. There's another little section of funding that's called categoricals, which is career and technical ed and gifted and talented, and some money for English language learners and special education. We're even raising that locally and having to pay our categorical funding, that's what that's called, back to the state. So we're not getting any of that. Now, one of the upsides, so while we have one of the lowest mill rates in the state, which raises our local funding against that assessed value, we then don't get the BS factor because the BS factor is taken out of the state equalization. Well, if you don't get it, there's nothing to subtract it from. One of the other effects of oil and gas is it can be volatile. So I was in this situation, this funding situation, which is called categorical buyout, back in 2015, 2016. And then a year later, our assessed value, because of a drop, we dropped 40% in that. So we went back into getting state funding, which means we got the budget stabilization factor back in 1 year. And then now 2 years later, we're back into categorical buyout. Now, we're grateful for what we have and our supportive community, which, you know, the assessed value and the low mill rates, what's allowed us to be able to do the mill levy overrides and bonds. But the volatility does make it difficult to plan.
Can you talk a little bit, too, about the impact of the cuts from the BS factor on your rural school district and rural school districts around you? And I guess your cuts, as you said, the BS factor doesn't impact you as much, but talk about the kinds of things that our rural districts have been forced to cut because of the BS factor.
Right. So, you know, it gets some to what Lisa was talking about. A lot of the districts are just not able to keep up with compensation, whether you're talking about wages or benefits. So then it's hard to hire teachers. And so then you have districts who are going without, so to speak, or they're combining things. Some of the smaller districts to my north, you know, they've combined grade levels. You know, it used to be fairly common for those districts, you know, to combine 2 grade levels like a K1 or grades 3 and 4. Now they're starting to combine 3 grade levels, so K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, being with 1 teacher. It's very difficult. It's getting to where it's very difficult to hire teachers at all. We used to say they were hard to find or hard to fill, and those were very often like special education, the sciences and math in high school or in the secondary schools, which is true. And some school districts, there's stories from around the state where districts have gone without a licensed high school math teacher for several years or a licensed high school science teacher for several years, which is why we have other programs to try to fill those. But when you're behind, the compensation isn't there, it is harder to find those folks. Does that
thank you.
help?
Danielle, what are you seeing around the state as you travel around to districts in terms of other impacts and other sort of equity issues for our rural kids?
I think, you know, along the same lines of what Glenn is talking about, to begin with, there's been a shallow pool of applicants in many of our rural districts, and I wouldn't even say it's a pool anymore. It's more of a drop, you know. So, I mean, the pool is pretty shallow. It's drying up. And so I think that's definitely a concern. I think districts are becoming more creative with staffing patterns, looking at succession planning and thinking about in future how they're going to reorganize based on the qualifications of their staff. A lot of what I see is that a lot of our rural districts become almost person dependent, and they rely so much on the skills of the people in their district that they really do adapt. And so I see a lot of that. But as Glenn's talking about combining classrooms and having multi-age, multi-grade classrooms, I think that's becoming something that is more common than it was in the past. And I just think, you know, based upon their needs locally, they're just having to adapt more and more. And also, I think they're maybe one of the opportunities or more positive things that has come out of it is more partnerships with the community
and relying on people in the community with special skills to come in and help and to think about ways that they can offer more in their schools with less, essentially. So that's a lot of what I see out in the field.
And we've talked a bit in other shows about the over-reliance on grant funding, and private and state grant funds, in order to meet certain needs around whether it's technology or course opportunities or mental health supports. I think we're seeing a lot more
and I
of
think
that.
Glenn can probably speak to this too, but there's definitely a capacity issue. And so while having opportunities for grants are, they're positive, they're also challenging at the same time, because our small districts just don't have the capacity to write those grants, to keep up with the requirements, to really have the manpower that it takes to provide some of those programs. So again, thinking about creative ways that they can address some of these challenges.
And so frequently those grants are great if you have the opportunity to get them, and then they're gone. Then it's over.
And then
sustainability, that's another thing. That's something else I think that comes up quite a bit, is how do we continue this once our funding runs out? And then that creates an additional layer of challenge. So lots of challenges
And I
here.
would add, there's, again, it used to be that maybe there was a common, but I really think rural districts are just, they pick something, and maybe it's not on a priority level, but it may be, well, we're going to cut this program because we can't find a teacher, or we can't afford everything, and so we're picking this. They work with their community, and we're not going to have you fill in the blank. Any one of those programs. Maybe it's music, maybe it's art, maybe it's an athletic program, or they're having to combine with somebody else. The one we didn't bring up that's a big topic of conversation across the state is the whole 4-day week. Many schools have gone to having school on 4 days out of the week instead of 5.
Glenn, clearly you're not following Redefining Rural, because we did do a show on that a couple months back. But that is a great point, and always worth reminding. And for those of you that want to listen to that show, do take a look on our homepage. You can hear some great insights around both the opportunities created and the opportunities lost.
Okay, so Glenn, can you talk to us a little bit about the rural funding, and then what your uses have been for that funding in your district for the past few years?
Okay. Well, this rural funding has been due to the efforts of some of the superintendents working on things, and it's supposed to be one-time money because there's no guarantee from year to year, which is, again, another topic. But we've used it some for some transportation. Again, it's supposed to be not ongoing costs. We've used it for some curriculum things. We've added a mental health professional this year. I know a number of other districts have used it to purchase equipment. They've used it for technology. They've used it for transportation. Many times that goes into deferred maintenance, which is one of those things of taking care of the facilities and the assets that you have.
So, and just so that the audience understands, 3 years ago, thanks, I would say, to Senator Sonnenberg and Representative Becker through Senate Bill 267, they, for the first time, allocated $30 million to rural school districts in the state. That we got that money again the following year, again thanks to those players and great advocacy work, as Glenn indicated, by rural superintendents and the support of the superintendents throughout the state. This last year, they were allocated $20 million of this one-time money for the third time, in recognition of the fact, as Lisa mentioned earlier, that the BS factor, because it cuts the factors, and those factors are intended to balance out the small economies of scale and small size and remoteness of rural districts, hits rural districts harder. So we're not done fighting for that money. We're trying to figure out a way to reconstrue it as not one-time money. But you'll be hearing more about that as we go forward through the legislature. Now we'd love to turn to Lisa to talk a little bit about what Great Ed and the coalitions are doing this both in November to bring some more money to education and then going forward.
Right. The things like this rural funding are Band-Aids on top of a problem that has just been compounding for decades. It's taken us a long time to fall $2,700 below the national average. And it's going to take a lot of those efforts. It may be a Band-Aid, but it's a critical Band-Aid that has really made a lot of difference to kids throughout Colorado and rural Colorado. So we really have to find those opportunities to make sure that we can bring a little bit more investment for our schools and some of the other things that in our economy and in our state that we need, like good, safe roads and bridges and a strong higher education system. And so we have been working together we have partners. One of the, I said we build coalitions. The most exciting and sustainable one is called the Great Schools Thriving Communities Coalition that came together in 2016 and has been building relationships among the practitioners, the teachers, the administrators, the school boards. Rural Schools Alliance is a part of it, but also a broad variety, the parents through PTA, Gifted and Talented Association, the Arc of Colorado, really a broad coalition, say we've got to do something to start fixing this bit by bit and then look toward a broader solution. Right now, what we have in front of us, I mentioned that voters are the tax policy makers in Colorado. The only time that we all can make tax policy as voters is when somebody puts something in front of us. And the legislature has done that this year with something called Proposition CC, which is an opportunity to use the benefits of a very strong statewide economy. That strong economy hasn't reached every corner of Colorado, but the Front Range especially has done very well. And we have a formula in our Constitution that was put in there 27 years ago. We've kind of outgrown a formula that doesn't allow us to even invest what's coming in under our current very low, nationally low tax rates to invest in things like K-12, higher ed, and transportation. So what the legislature put forward with the Prop CC is just saying, very simply, very common sense, without raising taxes, in order to support our public education and our higher ed and roads, bridges, and transit. And within our balanced budget, which is very important, can we just invest the amount that's not currently allowed to be retained and spent by the state? Can we invest that in the most important sort of public improvements that we all care about? And so a yes vote on Prop CC will allow about $100 million. We'll see, because it's as the economy changes, the number will change over time. But it looks like somewhere between $80 and $100 per student, basically, for K-12. It's divided, whatever comes in above that formula will be divided three ways between those things I mentioned, K-12, higher ed, and transportation. And what it will do, unfortunately, this has to be one-time dollars because we don't know how often those dollars will come in above that line. So again, it's non-recurring expenses, but just like that rural money has made a huge difference, these are dollars that can be spent on teacher bonuses, for instance. You can't use it for salaries because it's not ongoing, but you can do teacher bonuses. You can buy technology. You can broadband, so that you've got greater access to distance learning. And the most important thing is that those decisions were not made under the Gold Dome, but those decisions are going to be made where people can hold their folks most accountable, and where the decisions are made closest to the students. And that's our local school boards will be deciding how to use those dollars as they come in. Just a critical first step, and our coalition and others are going to just keep working at it and figure out common sense ways for us to turn this around, because it doesn't make sense that a state that we love so much, that does such a great job in preserving open space, that this state isn't able to provide the kind of opportunities that every student, no matter where they live, how they learn, what their zip code, to really launch them. And we know that Colorado cares about that, and that's having that opportunity this year. A lot of people don't know that there's an election in 2019. It's an odd year election, but it's a very critical election. So we need everybody to vote by November 5th. You'll get your ballot in probably mid-October. You got to get that ballot, vote yes on Proposition CC, and we're looking for as many people as possible to go to a website that we call publiceducationvoter.org and take part in helping let other people know that there's an election this year, that it's really important for our schools, and to be a public education voter this year, it means voting yes on Proposition CC.
So just to be clear, Proposition CC is on the ballot in November. Resources at publiceducationvoter.org. It is not a tax increase, but it does negate the tax refunds that would otherwise be required under
And I'm just going to jump in here. Is a rebate. Do not confuse this with the refunds that you get because you overpaid taxes.
Fair.
This is a rebate that is just dollars that came in above this artificial formula that we put in place when cell phones weighed like 5 pounds and the internet was like nobody had a clue what could happen and how we could transform our economy.
And I think we will be issuing a rebate this year, right?
That's correct.
The rebate that's required because of the Tabor surplus for 18-19 is not affected by Proposition CC. This is 19-20 and all years going forward if, and the big if is if the revenue generated by our economy is enough to exceed the Tabor cap.
And in those years, if Proposition CC doesn't pass, we will be sending back small amounts to individuals and foregoing some of these kinds of really important investments in our children's futures and in the economy in the form of a ready workforce and roads that move people.
Thank you for that. Can you talk a little bit about what else your coalition is working on going forward?
This coalition, and Michelle has tossed it to me, but she could answer the question herself. Since she's has been an incredibly valued and engaged member of our coalition. What we're looking for is sustained, equitable, adequate funding of our schools, and that is going to take. It means going to the legislature. The coalition worked very hard to. We were in support of the rural funding this year, and so we want to just bring everybody together and see where we can come to common ground. Some of these organizations that are together hadn't met each other except maybe to testify against each other at hearings, and the reason that was happening is because we're fighting over crumbs. And when we brought everybody together, we realized that if we all come together and think about addressing the bigger issue, then we can all recognize that the needs of rural students and gifted and talented students and special education students and students who are all of those things don't have to be pitted against each other. So we'll be looking at the legislature next year, and we'll be working with other groups that are trying to figure out putting something on the ballot that can make a difference for students for years to come. But the most important thing is being an inclusive and diverse coalition, so we're really listening to each other and being supportive instead of being, as I said, pitted against each other, which happened in the past every session. And now even just the ability for us to come together and talk about these issues has I think, expanded people's view. I think a lot of folks have learned about what's going on in rural schools from being in the room for the last almost 3 years.
We have seen a real shift in the Capitol from on some of our positions and some of the policies that we advance specific to rural based on the relationships and conversations that we've had at those coalition meetings, both within the finance conversations as well as others, student discipline, resources, teacher recruitment. It's really been quite remarkable, and we're quite grateful for that. I want to be clear, too, one of the issues that has come up is that even if Prop CC is to pass, it's sort of similar to we had an episode about where are the medical marijuana or where are the marijuana tax dollars going, and there's still great need in our schools. Even if Prop CC passes, I think Lisa said it's about $80 to $100 a student, which is in no way going to make up for the critical shortfalls around the state, and particularly in rural schools. So we will continue to talk about ways to generate additional revenue. We're also continuing to watch the work of the interim committee on school finance that has been working really hard under some great rural leadership, I might add, to tackle some of the questions and concerns that Glenn talked about with regard to the various factors, and are they working, are they creating equity, and are they equitable? So stay tuned as we get more into our advocacy space. We'll talk about that during the session.
I want to take just 1 minute. This could make it on or not. I just want to take a minute to go back to that marijuana question. That is the #1 question we get anywhere we go, anytime we post on Facebook. What happened to the marijuana money? And just for some perspective, it's about $40 million. The base is $40 million. That goes to the Building Excellent Schools Today program, which has done remarkable things for schools and for communities around the state, especially in rural communities. And so that money it's being used the way that it was supposed to be used, that marijuana money. It is helping students, but it does not go to operating. And so when people ask that question, they don't understand, even if it were going to operating, we're talking about $40 million. That's about $40 per student. Compared to the 600 that we've lost out on. So we always like to have an opportunity, and one of the things that makes me the happiest is when, before we even get to it on Facebook, other people are saying, no, here's where the dollars went. They were good. It's doing good stuff. But so I'd encourage anybody listening to be a part of that army of correcting. And we need to make sure that people don't next year say, we did marijuana and then we did Prop CC. Why is there still a need? We have to make it clear that this is critical work. We have to get this passed, and we have to keep working if we're going to do right by all the kids in every district around the state.
And just to add to that, we did a podcast on that. So if you need to know more about marijuana tax revenue, go back through our podcast and you can take a listen to that one to get more information.
Thank you. Thank you to Lisa and to Glenn and to Danielle. We're missing Kirk, as some of you may have noticed. He will be back next month. And take care. Talk soon.
Fantastic conversation that we just had, and be sure to vote yes on Prop CC. You can find more information about that at publiceducationvoter.org. So be sure to click on that link in the description below. Have a great day.